All right, welcome everyone. We'll give a minute for attendees to file in, and then we're going to get started with tonight's discussion. Thank you for being here. All right, attendees are still filing in, but let's go ahead and get started. My name is Stephen Overley. I'm on the executive board of the Journalism Alumni Network, and I'd like to welcome you all to our conversation tonight with 3 alumni who were Pulitzer Prize finalists in 2021. We're definitely excited to pick their brains about their honored work and sort of get some tips for elevating our own journalism. For those who may not be familiar, the Journalism Alumni Network launched last year and is basically a body whose goal is to convene graduates from the Merrill College and past iterations of the Merrill College so that we can get together for panel discussions like this, social, networking events, and all sorts of exciting things to come. So if that's of interest to you, it's very easy to join as long as you're a dues-paying member of the University of Maryland Alumni Association. You're automatically enrolled in the Journalism Alumni Network. You'll get information about our events, and we certainly welcome you and encourage you to join us. So for tonight's conversation, I'm going to hand it over to Marty Kaiser. Marty is the managing director of the University of Maryland's Capital News Service, meaning he oversees its many bureaus full of student journalists covering power centers, including Annapolis and Washington, D.C. He has a decades-long career in journalism, including roles as associate managing editor of the Baltimore Sun and the executive sports editor of the Chicago Sun-Times. From 1997 to 2015, Marty was the editor of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and during his tenure, the paper was a 3-time recipient of the Pulitzer Prize. So he certainly knows what it takes to produce this kind of caliber journalism. So Marty, I leave it in your very capable hands and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's really an honor to be part of this discussion tonight. Discussing Pulitzer Prizes and exceptional journalism doesn't get much better than that. And I know from my times judging, while we're not talking about winners, we're talking about finalists. But the way the juries work to do it, they pass on 3 finalists to the final judges, and often it is a very close call. So this is really outstanding, exceptional work. Tonight, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we'll jump into discussing the work and what they've learned from it, and sort of share some behind the scenes of what's going on here. First is Darcy Costello. Darcy is a class of 16. She's a reporter at the Baltimore Sun. She previously covered city government for the Courier-Journal in Louisville, and where she was part of the team that won the Pulitzer, was a Pulitzer finalist last year for breaking news and also public service. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Next is Nora Eckert. Nora's class of 20. She's at the Wall Street Journal based in Detroit, covering the auto industry as well as broader trends in retail, manufacturing, and technology. She's also worked on the investigations team, and where she was involved in being a finalist for the Wall Street Journal. She previously worked for the Post Bulletin in Rochester, Minnesota. And then Chris Weaver from 08, and he reports on the business of healthcare for the Wall Street Journal, also works with the investigations team. He's been a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I keep talking about the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, sorry about that, the Wall Street Journal. For more than a decade. In 2015, in fact, he was part of the investigations team that won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. He previously worked for Kaiser Health News. So Darcy, tell us a little bit about the work that the Courier-Journal did. But before you do, I want to tell you, the audience, a little bit about the recognition that the Courier-Journal got. And first, being a finalist in public service, and what the judges said about your work and the Courier-Journal's work was the award of being a finalist for its unflinching, comprehensive, impactful coverage of the killing of Breonna Taylor and the legacy of systematic racism in the police force and other civic institutions in Louisville, which helped spur important reforms. What's also amazing, and I'm not sure this has happened before, but the Courier-Journal also was a finalist in breaking news. It just doesn't happen that you get to be finalists in 2 different categories. And in breaking news, the judges said this was finalist award was given for exclusive coverage that contradicted police narratives and the killing of Breonna Taylor, and for its sensitive and innovative coverage of the aftermath. Darcy, tell us a little bit about the work of the Courier-Journal and also how you were involved, because so much of this is all team coverage.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so the breaking news entry that we were recognized for was really a lot of protest coverage. And that was, like you said, a complete team effort. It was really all hands on deck. The first night of protests in Louisville, 7 people were shot. And then later that same weekend, the police killed a man named David McAtee, who was a barbecue stand owner. And so I mean, and it was protests just generally that were like the size of which Louisville hadn't seen in recent history. So it was really like everyone pitching in however they could and taking turns going out to protest, and then taking turns like being the person who like wrote up the stories from that night. And then the public service entry that you mentioned was really the ongoing coverage of the killing of Breonna Taylor, and as you mentioned, sort of the zoomed out look at systemic racism across systems in Louisville. My role, I was one of 2 reporters that was really focused on the Breonna Taylor case for months on end, and it was at a time when it felt like it was like the story in Louisville. Like you mentioned, I covered City Hall, but it felt like this was all City Hall was focused on. This was all everyone was focused on. And so it was really sort of a privilege that we got to really dive deep, and that we had editors who also saw the value of diving deep into this case. The other reporter and I sort of focused on like the civil settlement or the civil case that resulted in a settlement, the internal affairs case and then the resulting police discipline, the investigations, criminal investigations, the reaction by the city and by the state, and sort of like the context of the raid. And we had other people focused on embedding with the protesters. And then we also had, COVID reporters, because that was happening at the same time, and other racial equity sort of projects going on. So yeah, that was my role, was kind of diving deep into the case with another reporter. And it was basically like every layer you pulled back, you would uncover another question, and it just kind of was never ending. So that was what my role was, finding questions to try and find answers to.
So let's jump to the Wall Street Journal and Nora Eckert and Chris Weaver. The award was for national reporting. What the judges said to the Wall Street Journal for its series of stories documenting how nursing home residents were hit particularly hard by the coronavirus pandemic, partially because of improper decisions made by government officials. Chris, start us off and tell you guys how you guys went about this.
Yeah, this story was born out of a series of conversations that different reporters and some of the editors at the Journal were having from the earliest days of the pandemic. I actually spent the first couple of months of the pandemic writing about testing, but I and my closest colleagues all agreed that the biggest story of the pandemic was going to prove to be what happened in nursing homes, because that was where people were dying, and by far the most out of proportion numbers. And we did a lot of different kinds of coverage of that space, starting with the first outbreak at the Life Care Nursing Home in Washington State, where we did as detailed as we could, investigation about what had happened there in the maybe a week or so after it occurred, and a lot of data stuff and a lot of policy stuff. And we felt that we needed to to cap that body of work. We needed to make sure that we were bringing our readers into a nursing home that was having a major outbreak in the most sort of comprehensive and cinematic and powerful way that we possibly could, without, mind you, actually being able to like go in ourselves and do anything, because they were all shut down to outsiders by that point. So the story that we ended up doing focused on a particular facility in central New Jersey. As you may recall, New Jersey and New York at that time, like May 2020, were the places that had been most hard hit by outbreaks. So we become interested in these veterans facilities or large facilities where a lot of people had died. And it took like one day of reporting to realize that the numbers that the government was publishing were far below the reality of the toll that had taken place even by that point. And we just started, pulling thread on that, and eventually conceived the story that became the sort of the lead story in the broader package that we submitted for a Pulitzer. I mentioned just a second ago the challenge of trying to get into facilities that were locked off to the public for good reason. And the way that we ultimately ended up approaching this one was I had obtained a list of, initially just a list of everybody who had died there and the date they died, through a source in that case. And we started contacting family members, and the staff were really hush hush. The managers weren't saying anything because they were already being threatened with potential litigation from the families of people who had died in their care. But the families, of course, were answering the phone, and many of them were happy to talk. And were frustrated and for the most part, frankly, in the dark. But they did tend to have insight into these sort of brief windows of time when their particular relative was getting sick and dying. And it became clear that if we were to contact enough of them, we'd be able to stitch together those little windows into a bigger portrait of what was going on over the course of this facility's 2 or 3 month grappling with the pandemic. And we ultimately at least attempted to contact all of 112 people who died between March and May. And we spoke to, I forget the exact number now, but more than 80 people representing something like 76 of the families in order to stitch that broader narrative together.
What led you to that particular facility?
Well, like I said, we wanted to find a nursing home that stood out, and it seemed kind of obvious in some ways to try to find the nursing home that had the most people who died. And it wasn't really clear that was going to be possible, but based on the data that was publicly reported and what we ultimately got the Department of Health to confirm, it was quite clear that this was a facility that had somewhere near the top of the list. And it, at the time we published the story, it actually appeared to be the deadliest one. When I first waded into it, there was actually another veterans home in North Jersey. This one was in a town called Menlo Park, and there was a second one in Paramus that I actually thought might be the focus because it had at that time more reported COVID fatalities. But on further reporting, we got more interested in Menlo because there were some issues with the way that they had elected to report deaths. And it didn't take long to find out that the reality was that more people had died there than its sister facility in Paramus.
So Nora, talk a little bit about your work on the project. And
yes, Chris was bringing me in, very, very grateful for, and we started off just saying, let's start working through this number as well as we can, and that really grew into through all of them. Chris sent out a list of names for those to week, and it off being a really scary for me, calling people at the most vulnerable time. A lot of one buried, some family members, and just a lot of grief and I wanted to talk about it. Some of them didn't. We're very wary of getting calls from a Wall Street reporter about this, especially some of these people who are used to being phone scams and very reluctant to give any information over the phone. So we started our way through and as many people we could, collecting documentation from them, text, emails, certificates and piecing together that timeline. And along with this, I would communicate regularly about who seemed to be the example of the songs that we saw at work. And I kept a long run document, as back over those conversations. David to Chris about who we should keep and get in touch with, who we should follow up with.
Hey, Nora, you're breaking up just a little bit. Are you using headphones?
Oh, sorry. Here.
Because you were great when we tested a few minutes ago. I don't know whether anything's changed, but it was breaking up a little. Yeah, try again. Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me now.
Oh, much better now. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That's great. One of the I think that was important in all of this work, after reading through it and talking with you all beforehand, was the importance of getting a hold of public records, and that is just so important to this kind of work and good investigative work. For that matter, just plain good reporting. And so often politicians and public officials keeping this away from not just the news media, but I'd argue the public. Darcy, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you did in Louisville, and then Chris and Nora, you can talk about the importance of public records in your work.
I would say public records really shaped our understanding of what happened at Breonna Taylor's apartment that night. The initial information was pretty sparse, and this wasn't an incident that was captured on video. So it was really up to people to kind of put the information together to understand exactly what happened. And it was kind of a complex situation. And so there was like a trickle of public records that we would get. And I feel like each piece kind of like furthered our understanding, and we could like see the bigger picture a little bit better. One of the early things we got was the 911 call from Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, where you hear him tell a 911 dispatcher, like somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend. And that, I just feel like every record kind of like spawned additional questions. So that kind of led to, okay, did she get medical treatment? Did the dispatchers dispatch a paramedic for her? And the answer to that was no. Or, he used the word somebody. So did he know it was police that were knocking at the door? And the answer we learned later was that it was kind of in dispute whether police had like sufficiently announced themselves so that the residents could tell it was police that were banging on the door in the middle of the night. And so, it was just like after the 911 call, we got the dispatch logs that showed that, okay, there wasn't a paramedic that went in to treat Breonna Taylor. And, even beyond just like the basic public records, like there was body camera footage of officers arriving on scene after the fact that helped to better flesh out like what other people in the area knew was happening. There were officers that were serving simultaneous warrants that you could hear on the body camera footage didn't know that this warrant was being served. So that kind of, I don't know, it just kind of like was putting the pieces together. And I think in terms of like attaining the public records, it wasn't always easy. I think we got denied on a lot of them early on. And actually the 911 call we got from a source, we'd heard about it for a long time and finally got a source to release it to us, and we published it. And then the city decided to release it like shortly thereafter. And so it was helpful in this case to go through and know what public records would be created. I spent time like going through the standard operating procedures for police to figure out like, what do you have to fill out when you're getting a search warrant? What other forms would you have to fill out? And then after like a shooting takes place, what documentation gets created internally in the police department that might shed additional light? And I found that like, if you knew the specific record that you wanted, it helped when you were going around and trying to bother people to give it to you. One example is a SWOT matrix. That it was something that they would have to fill out when they had a search warrant. And it was like a scoring system when you would like figure out if it was necessary for SWAT to serve the warrant rather than just like a narcotics officer. And that like proved consequential in this case because I think it may have been a different approach had SWAT been the one to serve it. But we would just like ask, like, do you have a copy of a SWAT matrix? Even if it was just like a blank one, it would like really help us to understand like what they knew going into the situation that night. Like, did they think that there would be a firearm in the home? How many people did they think would be in the home? Like that kind of stuff. And so I think like being creative about how you get the public records also helped like the pursuit of them in this case.
Chris, Nora, tell us about your experiences getting public records and
Public
importance to
records
your project.
were really important to this project, in large part because the government wasn't saying anything about what had happened at the facility. Like the New Jersey officials who ran this place, it was a state-run veterans home, to be clear. So the public records requests that we were making were mostly to the state of New Jersey under the law called OPRA. And the officials didn't want to talk about it. They kind of made generic statements to the effect that they'd done everything right and so forth, like that they notified families as soon as possible, blah, blah, blah. And we made a series of records requests and obtained a large volume of emails between officials that gave us a great deal of insight into what people knew at what particular moment in time and how they were addressing the crisis that they were facing to one another. So like, for instance, we had, to refute the example I just gave, we had evidence of managers sharing a report that a patient had tested positive for COVID exactly a week before they ever told anybody about it, and also just kind of like some insight into kind of where they were at in their minds as they approached their situation. Like there was one moment when an official was like, "Oh, we got this," it was almost enthusiastic, which was kind of surprising in the face of the crisis that they were undergoing at that time, and also just total gems that opened up new territory. Like one department, so one of the issues at the facility was that they had banned staff from wearing masks, and a lawyer for the department that ran this place used the phrase mask insubordination. Like they had a new mask insubordination policy that would cover how managers should punish employees who committed so-called mask insubordination, such as, wearing masks at work, at a time when the Department of Health in New Jersey was saying that all healthcare facilities should implement universal masking. So that was illuminated, it let us kind of catch them out in a few places and also get insight into how they were thinking about their problems as they encounter them. We also use records that, were not public to I think great effect in this project. Stuff we got, other ways from sources and people involved and so forth. And some of those were records that showed on basically a day-by-day accounting of what was going on with each patient, so you would know who was sick and what symptoms they had. And that let us both visualize the total toll that the virus took on the facility, but also track the way that they move people around the facility in a frequently haphazard fashion. And when, for instance, when they were attempting to segregate people who they believed had COVID, they were at the same time exposing people who were already in the unit who didn't have COVID, and then moving them out to other units after they moved the COVID people in, and so forth, kind of germinated the virus throughout the facility. And it let us, have a window into that as well.
Nora, anything to add on the?
No, just that I learned a lot from Chris on public records while reporting on them. So yeah, nothing to add.
Yeah, I think we had about 2,000 emails at one point, and Nora had a huge chunk of those to read through with the assignment of let me know if you see anything good.
Well, so that leads to a question. I'll let Nora start this time and go back around the other way. But as you think about this work and the project, is there something that stands out that, reading 2,000 emails is pretty tough, but also that was the hardest part of it, that was maybe the most frustrating, or the part, maybe not even frustrating, something that you had to really work hard on to make this successful?
Yeah, it's hard because I'm very early on in my career, so I don't have. I'm so lucky to have gotten on this project so young. So I think my frame of reference is, a little smaller on that front. But I think for me, the tough part was balancing trying to systematically and very strategically work through all of these families while also remembering that I'm calling them about a loved one they lost. And that's a tough balance because you don't just want to be empathetic so that you get more information out of someone. You want to be empathetic because this is the hardest time, of their life. So I think that personally was the struggle that I had, because I found myself getting really in the zone trying to, talk to as many of these people as we could, because there's only so many hours where you can call these people. And I had to step back from time to time and really reflect on some of the harder calls and remember, this is a daughter who's singing Ave Maria to her mother over Zoom. And, my mom is still living. I can call her whenever. So I think that that was important, and also recentered me on why this work was so vital. So yeah, that was probably it for me.
And how did you had to contact these people on the phone? Were you able to visit any of them? How did
Yeah, I was working remotely from Milwaukee actually during the pandemic, so I couldn't visit any of these people. We were just all through the phone. So that was tough because it's all cold calls. A lot of time you're not sure that the number's going to work. So yeah, and as everybody on this call knows, it's tough to get someone to pick up the phone and share information in those sorts of situations. So Chris and I developed techniques through making all these calls and found ways, within a few minutes of someone picking up the phone, you kind of understand what they might respond to, if they need to just talk about their loved one for 30 minutes, or if they just want to know exactly why you're calling and they want to talk for 5 minutes. So just kind of figure out what kind of person they are when they pick up.
You obviously learn how to go about talking to people, and I'm sure get better each time learning how to talk. I once worked with a award-winning reporter, and she had to go out and talk to a relative after one of the space shuttles crashed, and she was the only one to get an interview because they slammed the door, everybody else. But she got there first, and her whole thing was, she said, I just want to get in the door. I'm going to be friendly. I'm going to be talking. I'm not even going to bring up what I'm going to talk about. Once I get in the house, then I can start asking the questions. They talked to her and then they refused to talk to anybody else. And I just thought that was a really interesting, instead of booming in with questions or things, just get into the house. So yeah, obviously you had to learn a lot from that.
Yeah, there was one particular example that came up in Nora's reporting where a family had recorded a video of their final moments via Zoom with this particular woman who had died, but they didn't want to share it at first, and it was sort of typical of this kind of project, but a good I think learning experience where Nora had to go back to them multiple times to try to get them to turn around, and eventually we did get it. And I forget exactly what the winning tactic was, but Nora had conceived of and reached some compromise with them that worked for everybody.
Never give up, right? Never give up.
Right.
Darcy, what stands out for you? Is there anything really stands out sort of as most difficult in this project, or thing you had to work really hard on?
Yeah, I think all of it was really hard. I think
Good answer.
Like just a really emotional, like devastating story, and her killing affected so many Louisville residents, like personally, like who saw themselves in her. So it was really difficult constantly. And there was also a period of time that I remember was really challenging when the entire city was kind of waiting with bated breath to see what the decision was from the Attorney General, who was considering criminal charges against the officers and bringing it to a grand jury to make that call. And there were, like, I would say weeks, if not months, where we would hear like, oh, it's going to be tomorrow. Oh, it's going to be tomorrow. And it was like constantly like gearing yourself up. And it wasn't just us that was like feeling that. It was the entire city. Like at one point they put up barricades or they boarded up the windows of the courthouse, and it was like a huge like outcry because everyone was just so on edge for months on end. But I can answer your question in a different way and say sort of my version of the 2000 emails is we sifted through returned warrants. So it was just like stacks and stacks of paper warrants that had been served in I think it was maybe a year's time, and we were looking for no-knock warrants specifically, but it would be, we created this database that had like zip code, race, gender, age of the suspect and what they found and like what kind of case it was. And so I think a few colleagues and I just spent like days at this conference table in the courthouse with like all of these records spread out, and we would just be flipping through the paper. And it's kind of funny because it turned out in this story that we published that looked at the fact that the no-knocks in Louisville had been targeting Black residents in the historically disenfranchised West End of the city. But you didn't really see like how much went into like that one story and how much like paper we churned through over several hours. So that wasn't the hardest part, to be clear, but that was one like time consuming, like how the sausage gets made moment.
Chris, anything stand out for you that you haven't mentioned already?
Well, one thing I was going to mention was not so much a challenge for the story we're talking about tonight, but for the stories that I did afterwards, the 7 or 8 follow-up stories, is that, as I mentioned, we had great success getting public records in this case. I got this great trove of illuminating emails. But when I went back to try to get more records about, well, the thrust of it was that I'd found out that the managers of this nursing home who had got fired after our story ran had paid themselves bonuses illegally using CARES Act money. And I wanted various records about that. And I found out that the guy who had run their public records department and who had responded substantively to my request when I was doing the story that we're all here together tonight over, had been relieved of his duties in that department and reassigned to something else in the agency. And the person who replaced him didn't want to release like anything. The lawyers were involved in like every series of correspondence, and it took a series of lawyer letters from our side to get them to respond, just minimally to the request. So that was sort of an example of the way that sometimes a victory in that area can turn out to kind of close off an avenue altogether.
So I take you back to your time at Merrill College at University of Maryland, and tell us each one thing that you learned that makes a difference in what you do today. Nora, you want to start us off and you think back to something you learned here that really makes a difference today?
I think I might be stealing this one, and Marty and I talked about it, but the fact checking is a huge thing. When I was there, at least I think it's always been, but the journal especially has a super rigorous fact checking process, especially for investigative work and, rounds of legal vetting as well. And it felt similar to what we've been through in some of our Merrill investigations. I think, it's, and to be fair, some of our Diamondback reporting goes through the same 5 fact checks. So I think, working on those types of projects with the Diamondback and at Merrill was so great in setting a solid foundation for instilling that terror in every sort of story. I think it's really, really helpful.
Chris, there one for you?
I thought particularly the news bureaus at Merrill did a great job of breaking reporters into the harsh reality of having to call a bunch of strangers or walk up to a bunch of strangers' doors and ask them uncomfortable questions like what Nora was talking about. And this was a story where that really counted. I should also say, while we're on the topic, that that my and Nora's partnership in this story was born out of the Merrill alumni connection, because Deb Nelson and Raphael had given me a heads up that Nora was coming to the Journal as an intern, just as I was getting this story off the ground. And she was actually in the audio department, but we ended up monopolizing a big chunk of her time and actually extending the internship to work on this project. And And part of the reason that it seemed like such a good fit was that we knew Nora wanted to do investigative work, and it was the kind of story where there was a lot of opportunity for a new reporter to kind of expand on that, teeth cutting exercise of just wading through a ton of interviews, and it worked out wonderfully.
Darcy, is there one thing for you that you could go back and?
I don't think this is a specific skill that I learned, but sort of an outlook, which is being skeptical and wanting proof of what people are saying. I think going back to the initial police statement and kind of questioning what was left out and what additional context would make for a better understanding of the situation. An example of that is there was a remark made by the chief at the press conference immediately following the shooting that, this unit wasn't assigned body cameras, so that's why they didn't have them. And then come to find out months later, actually some had been assigned body cameras, and that's part of their disciplinary cases, was why they weren't wearing the body cameras. So it's kind of like saying, okay, they weren't assigned body cameras, like who was and why weren't they? And kind of like pushing back in wanting kind of evidence. And I think a piece of that too was the importance of being really clear about where your information was coming from in stories. This was a situation where there were a lot of facts in dispute and a lot of facts kind of changing as people's understanding grew. So it was important to say, this is how we know this is who's saying this. And I think in addition to helping for accuracy, it also helped readers to kind of vet the source of the information and kind of decide for themselves what to take away from it. We kept an online shared folder of all of our source documents, and constantly we're going back to them, rereading the warrant, that kind of stuff, just to make sure that we were accurate and attributing correctly.
So one more question sort of tied back to your time at Merrill College. Each of you, what would you tell students that you know now that you wish you'd known when you were here at College Park? Nora?
I think try to take advantage of all of the hands-on editing, because I worked at a local outlet before coming to the Wall Street Journal, and most places you're not going to get that, and it's so important to try to learn from that whenever you can. So I know it can be frustrating and painful when you're getting sort of the ego beat out of you, which is a good thing also, but I think really just try to embrace that and learn from the edits. And also there is so much and more, I saw there's a new major added now regarding data journalism, and Sean Mussenden and that whole team are incredible. And as Chris knows much better than I do, data journalism is a huge key to get into this world, especially at a high level. So I think taking advantage of additional skills like that is a huge part of what I would have liked to have done more, even at Merrill.
Chris?
I kind of second that last point Nora made, because that is, that's one of the skills of journalism that really can be learned outside of, just its daily practice. And, there's more, I think, on offer now than when I was around, but I could have better availed myself of those opportunities even then. And then the other thing is I often reflect on how valuable the Capitol News Service Bureau experience was for me going into it, and I reflect a lot on how how the continuation of that working as a beat reporter is such an essential set of building blocks to developing a career in investigative journalism, even though I didn't really want to do it at the time. Not the news service, the beat reporter job. So I thought that was great preparation that I as much as I loved, Adrian and Raphael, I could have probably leaned into even more.
Well, and this wasn't a setup, because we're adding more, or even since you left, everyone goes through in the Capstones and the bureaus data workshops beginning of the semester. And so this nice of you to say that. It ties in directly what we're doing. And Chris says this was not a setup. As managing director of Capitol News Service, having you say nice things about it is really important. And in my short time here, I couldn't agree more with you. I've really been impressed with what students were able to get out of that year. Darcy, something that you want to tell students that you know now and wish you'd known when you were at University of Maryland?
I have two. The first one, this might just be me being naive. I don't know that this is something all students don't know or need to be told, but the importance of like having a relationship with sources that isn't just transactional. I was covering City Hall going into this reporting, and I would, have the luxury of like trapping council members and like asking them questions and getting the bill drafts I needed or a comment for a story or whatever, but it wasn't necessarily a conversation where I was like bouncing ideas off of them or like shooting the breeze just to like keep that relationship going kind of. So this we kind of created a beat around this case. And I found it really important, especially being in the pandemic where you weren't really seeing people face to face as much, to kind of just call and check in and like build that trust and kind of have a relationship where you can be curious and kind of talk about things and get story ideas through that, instead of just treating sources as people to, put in your story, like insert quote here. But yeah, that might just be me, like not being a great student journalist. Maybe that's a lesson that people just learn. And then the other thing is kind of on a darker note, which is that I think it's really important to keep track of your like own well-being as you're reporting on really difficult topics. I think a lesson I learned was to recognize your own limits kind of and step away when you need to rest or recharge or whatever. It was a really intense story to cover, and I think everyone involved kind of hit a breaking point at certain points over the few years that we were really in the trenches on it. And I think it was a learning curve to realize that like no one's going to recognize when you're reaching your limit, only you can. And that's when you have to kind of like let people know that, hey, like I'm going to take tomorrow off and be sure to step back. And I think that's important for your long-term career in the industry, but also just like for you as a human being, because that's important too.
So one, if you've got questions, put them in the chat. And before I turn over to questions, though, could you talk a little bit about the impact that the stories had and what you've seen changed in whether it's the nursing, industry like homes and through the pandemic, and then Darcy, what you've seen change after the Louisville Courier Journal's coverage, the impact of the Breonna Taylor story. Chris, Nora.
I mean, the impact. I mean, the most direct impact that we had was on one nursing home. The one that was the focus of the story, and and that was real. The governor quickly moved to relieve the person who was the commissioner of the department that oversaw the facility, as well as the managers who ran the nursing homes. DOJ opened a civil rights investigation several weeks later into the conduct there. The guy running that department at the time said he had the article taped on the wall above his computer, and then there was more fallout over the next year as we continued to cover the story, and for instance, we ultimately got the state to recoup the bonuses that those people had illicitly awarded themselves. What the broader industry learned from it, I don't know. I think they got vaccines, and that was what they learned. I think that industry is going to continue to face a reckoning, though, because I think they've got structural issues on so many different fronts that going back to the status quo could prove to be difficult. But we'll see. Incumbency is incredibly powerful.
Nora, you want to add anything more about impact? Darcy, talk about the impact in Louisville.
Yeah, so I don't think the CJ, the Courier, can take all the credit for all of the changes that happened in Louisville, because there were people out marching on the streets and there was huge outcry and national attention and all kinds of stuff. But I do think that there was like an incredible amount of change that came in the wake of the Breonna Taylor killing and its aftermath, and our coverage as a small part possibly. One thing was the passage of Breonna's Law, which banned no-knock warrants. That happened in Louisville, and then a version of it passed statewide as well. They went through 4 police chiefs in the span of a year. The original one got fired because there weren't body cameras at the killing of David McAtee, who I mentioned died in the first weekend of protests. And there were 2 interims and then a permanent chief. They also created the first like sort of substantive civilian review board and inspector general to oversee the police department, which I think was a reflection of the desire for more civilian oversight. The mayor also created a top to bottom review of the police department that tried to identify like problem areas in the department, which is also going to be used by Louisville's Department of Justice investigation. That's funny that there's 2. And the mayor also moved shooting investigations from within the police agency to state police investigating. So I think it's kind of like the recognition that like the police were kind of policing themselves for these shooting investigations. There were also a series of like really small changes, but like were directly related to what was uncovered over the course of these months of reporting. They changed the body cam requirements. They also changed when tear gas can be used on protesters. They changed the review process for the warrants and like the search warrant affidavits and the matrices that you have to fill out in advance to kind of make sure that people are laying eyes on these before they get too far down the road. So there were a whole host of changes, but yeah, I don't think it's fair for us to claim all of them, just maybe a little bit.
So here's some questions. Place your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as possible. From Anthony Fama, hi, hope all is well. This is more of a general question, but how have you all confronted or dealt with public officials, such as police officers, that are reluctant to give you sensitive information about a topic or story? I've had trouble in the past being able to gain potentially important information within stories because officers did not give me the proper info I was looking for. Anyone want to jump in on this one?
I can try. Not knowing the specifics is kind of hard, but
Sure.
Some things I would think about maybe are people outside the department who might have some understanding of the topic you're trying to get at. Like if there's a legislative body that's been made aware of this issue, if they can kind of pressure the police to release them information, like sometimes allying yourself with someone who can ask questions that you also want the answer to can be beneficial. I also think using public records requests could be good, depending on the nature of the information you're trying to get. And I also think there's probably someone in the department that would be willing to talk more with you on background if you were able to kind of build sources in different areas. I think sometimes it just takes finding someone in an agency that understands what journalism is and what you're trying to do and can see the good in talking you through things, even if it's like on background or something like that. So those would be some ideas.
And just keep it after it, and arranging to run into that person, coming up with excuses to contact them or communicate with them, both formally and more casually. I can't say the state because I don't want the person to be identified, but I once contrived to be in the position of giving a law enforcement person I wanted to develop a source relationship with a phone call mentioning that I was in his or her hometown, which is more than 1,000 miles from where I live, just as the person was getting off of work. And a beautiful relationship was born out of 3 or 4 Guinnesses.
Another one. What capstones and internships were you part of during your time at Merrill College? Could you talk about the transitions from college to the professional endeavors?
I can jump in there. So I had, sorry, we're experiencing like 3 different weather spells here right now. But I interned for NPR's investigations team, which was wonderful. And I give full credit to Deb Nelson and an amazing investigative project we did in collaboration with AP. with Capitol News Service. It was like the origins of the Howard Center at that point on jail suicides, which I still think to this day is like one of the most rewarding things, and really prepared me to work with Chris on this story. So yeah, NPR, and then also some work with the AP. And then I was an intern at the Wall Street Journal, which is one of, I think, the few larger outlets that really loves to hire interns right out the gate, which is great. Yeah, but definitely like taking advantage of Capitol News Service. And also, I know this isn't exactly what you were asking, but like, I think my first year of the master's program, I was really interested in working with Sean and the data bureau of CNS, and I couldn't fit it in as a class, but we would just work on like, you know, off hours, or once in a while, he'd even like help me work through problem sets on the weekends to try to brush up on that. So if you feel like, I mean, that's a little psychotic, I wouldn't do that. But if you feel like you want to spend your Saturdays doing SQL, like most of the professors are really willing to help you there. So don't feel like you have to think inside of the box of, you know, you've got these 4 classes. You can reach out to people ad hoc as well.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I can.
Yep.
I did a few internships. I did the Carroll County Times through the MDDC Foundation, and then I worked at the Baltimore Sun. I was actually a features intern at the Baltimore Sun, which is funny because that's not at all what I do now, but it was interesting to try. And when the Baltimore Sun calls, you say yes. And I also interned after college at the Associated Press doing state legislative coverage. And then while I was in school, I did Capitol News Service. And I also did a ton of like Diamondback stuff. Not a ton, I shouldn't exaggerate. I didn't do a ton of Diamondback stuff. I did Diamondback stuff, which was really valuable as well. I think that really is like a hands-on, you're doing the journalism job type of experience. So that really helped me a lot too.
Diamondback is huge. Sorry, that is, yeah, massive. If you can make time for that, that was a huge part of my experience as well.
Another question from one of the Male College greats, Ira Chenoy. This panel is terrific, and it's great to see one of my former students here. Hi, Chris. I have 2 questions. Chris, did you build master chronologies of everything that you learned, and what topped out of that as you did that?
We sort of decorated a chronology that we obtained from obtained in the form of records of this nursing home, where we had like a almost medical chronology of what was going on with the people, and reported kind of around that, and then sort of matched up the email traffic and other records that we got through public records requests to kind of where it fit into. So that, I mean, this was an unusual story in that the starting point was a sort of a chronology, rather than having to build it out of, in different interviews and documents. That said, like each source that we spoke to could only account for like 2 days of the, the chronology. So it was a little bit, one of the challenges of the story is that we ended up having a whole lot of voices and not many central characters, which I think hurt the readability. But we were struggling to figure out a way to execute it that would have been more typical of a newspaper narrative, where you would want to follow like a protagonist or 2 who most exemplify the other people, and then layer in some other examples throughout. But that was I think a reaction to just the nature of what we were trying to, the story we were trying to tell.
The other part of our other question is, Darcy, you talked about finding out what the standard operating procedures were, and that is so important. And I'm wondering what popped out from that sort of thing in your investigations.
Yeah, going through standard operating procedures is not the most exciting read, but it's super important. It tells you not only just like the forms that get created, but also you can kind of get a better understanding of the rules of engagement almost. I think it was really helpful during the protests. There was a lot of use of tear gas and like projectiles. And so it was helpful to understand like what the rules were around when those could be used and who had to sign off and that kind of thing. So you could ask better questions of the officials. I also think a story that's not entirely related to this Pulitzer entry that came out of having a good understanding of SOPs. There was an officer who was federally charged for hitting a kneeling protester in the back of his head with a riot stick, and we were able to look into that officer's history in an interesting way. We knew this was a force case, so then I don't remember if I like had to go through SOP right after this happened or if I knew about it, but SOP outlines use of force reports that get created for every incident that then go up through the chain of command so that they can decide if they need to be flagged for further review or not. And so they're called blue team reports. And so for this officer, we were able to request all of his blue team reports and kind of trace the incidents that had happened over the years where he did use questionable amounts of force, sometimes prompting higher ups to ask further questions and sometimes not. But it helped to like flesh out this officer's history, knowing that he had this one obviously problematic case that the feds charged him on. But then we could paint a better picture of his history with the department. And that just came out of knowing that these blue team reports exist, because otherwise you could ask for a personnel file, but that's not necessarily going to be what you get. You might get just like commendation letters. So I think knowing what the agency you cover, what forms and what like documentation they maintain is really important to get at unique approaches to stories sometimes.
Here's one from Rafael Lorente. If you could go back in time, what's the one piece of advice that you'd give to yourself at graduation that would have sped up your development as a reporter? Sort of similar to what we were talking about before, but if you think back to what you could have done right after graduation that might have sped up your development.
Stop the pandemic would have been that would have helped things out a bit, but no, it's all good now.
Chris, Darcy, anything come to mind?
I kind of think I needed the lessons that after graduation taught me. I feel like there's not like one thing that I could have. There's so many like little lessons you learn in your early years as a reporter that like I kind of want to have made those mistakes to be where I am now. Sorry, that's a cheesy answer.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I sort of wish I could have been just try being a local reporter, like a cops and courts reporter at a local or regional paper. I never had that chance. Although I can't say that would have sped up my career. It might have slowed it down, but I think it would have been a rewarding detour. And if I could do it over, I might have tried for that. I had this particular subject matter expertise that I allowed to kind of propel me, and that might have been a good kind of like dual track, I guess.
So time for one last question. The question is, it's clear from that you all know and what Pulitzer Prize winning reporting looks like, but what's, do you think, the biggest factor that separates or characteristic that separates Pulitzer journalists from other everyday journalists? What's that extra piece necessary to achieve an award? And as I said in the beginning, it's not just the awards. There's so many, I know from judging that you get down to the end and there's 6 or 7 that are really fantastic often. And we all hear the winner and the 2 finalists, but we never hear what finishes 4th. And oftentimes it's very good and wins, actually may win lots of other awards. But can you all kind of briefly come up with sort of one thing that a characteristic that really separates the top flight reporting from regular reporting?
I mean, I don't really think about what will win awards. I try to focus on what I think can get impact. I try to pick things that are narrow enough and concrete enough. Like, I'm not trying to change the nursing home industry. I'm trying to hold people accountable at one nursing home because it's what I can do and what I know can deliver on that. And I think that also happens to help with particularly investigative journalism awards, because many of them are judged largely on the impact that they achieve. And, big impact about a small corner of the world, I think, counts for more than, some hand wringing about a big corner of the world. The other thing that I'd say is that I think that I've noticed that I don't know that I mean, I hope I'm a practitioner of it myself. I'm not sure, but I've noticed that a lot of projects that really think outside the box in their reporting techniques attract a lot of this kind of attention. Like one I just noticed as a good example was I forget which paper it was, but somebody had done a project, it might have even been Milwaukee, where they hired like electricians to inspect houses and had determined that there were electrical hazards and fire hazards in particularly black parts of the city, black neighborhoods of the city that this was in, and like that kind of like just stretching your imagination of how you can go about finding and collating and analyzing information. I think helps win awards, not because it's gimmicky, but because it opens the door to knowledge that the traditional methods were leaving, untapped.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is Milwaukee, and one of the reporters is former Pulitzer winner herself. But the thinking of ways to go after stories that haven't been done before, it's really often makes for great stories. Nora and Darcy, get one last other shot at the separation that Chris was talking about.
Yeah, I think from what I can tell, and this is probably just because I didn't understand this coming in, but data is such a huge part of any award-winning investigation. I should have known that, just being in school, but I didn't quite wrap my head around it until working with Chris, because of course, what other way can you show that something is a widespread problem and sort of debunk any illusions that it's an anomaly without having that data. So again, that goes back to why I think it's so important to try to bolster those skills early on. And I'm still have on my to-do list every week to like try to do more data journalism. And so I think that is the big distinguishing element that I can see.
Darcy, you get the last word.
I don't really think there's like two separate categories, like Pulitzer journalists and regular journalists. Like, I don't think for our coverage, we were just chugging along, trying to answer questions for the community, like doing regular old reporting we would be doing if there weren't a national spotlight on the city at the time. And I think like the one thing I would say might distinguish like a reporter who does well than a reporter who kind of like stays kind of stagnant is just like jumping into stories and saying yes, and when an opportunity is presented, kind of making yourself available. I got on this story as a City Hall reporter just because I asked if the reporter who wrote the first story needed help like filing records requests or something, and then we just kind of ended up sticking through it to the end. So I think just like saying yes, and like if you think something's interested, like asking if you can help and jumping in. It sounds like Nora did a really good job of that too. So and also just thinking that like a regular journalist can be a Pulitzer journalist. There's no distinction.
Right. I think you touched on it. It's so important. Just being curious. What more is there? What am I missing? Where else could we dig? How could we find more about this story? And often the great stories can be complicated and really forced digging into. Thank you very much. This has really been fascinating. I would commend that everyone who is, if they haven't read this work, who's watching this tonight, to go read some of this work. A lot of it's available through the Pulitzer website. If you have a Wall Street Journal subscription, the way that the graphics and the presentation that was done on the Wall Street Journal work was just fantastic. It's really smart thinking about how to use technology to tell stories in better and more impactful ways. And the Courier Journal has done a lot of that too. So thank you all very much. I've enjoyed this, and thank you for your time. I've learned so much from you tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.